All right, so our next author is Hannah Carey, and she is going to be discussing writing female characters in fantasy. Hannah, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to share your PowerPoint out. So go ahead and start.
Okay, all right. I have a lot to cover in this. There's a lot of terms that are going to get covered in this. I am going to try and get through it and try to not overwhelm anybody in the process. But if you have questions, leave them in the chat box, and I'll try and make sure that I don't lose anybody with this. So Josette, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so for me, when I wanted to start writing, one of the things that I wanted to address, were things like agency for female characters and things like the male gaze, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about that as we keep going. And I knew for me, fantasy was one of my favorite genres, and I wanted to address those things in that genre. And this has been honestly a steep learning curve for me the past few years. And I always tell everybody I am still learning about these things and how to address these things in my own writing and my awareness of them. So, jumping right in, everything that we talk about today is going to be from the perspective of fantasy, but a lot of this stuff is, like cross genre. It's going to apply like across the board. Um, but we're going to focus in on fantasy. And one of the things to remember with fantasy, in particular, high fantasy. Now, when you've got fantasy, especially nowadays, we have lots of different subgenres, and that you can have, fantasy realism, I know was discussed by one of the authors earlier. You can have urban fantasy. Those are going to be in very different settings, but in kind of your traditional fantasy, what we call high fantasy or epic fantasy, that is generally based on, medieval time periods or medieval like settings. And one of the important things that we have to remember that with that is that in medieval times, you're dealing with very patriarchal societies traditionally. And those patriarchal societies, just by nature, are going to lack agency for women. And I included kind of a simple definition for agency on the slide for everybody. And when we talk about someone's agency, we talk about it's the trait that makes someone an active agent in their own life and in the world as a whole. When you're giving a character or a person agency, you're not stripping away their control. You're not, making it so they're not in control of their choices or their own destiny, so to speak. And historically, when it comes to fantasy, in particular when it comes to high fantasy and epic fantasy, much of fantasy, if we look at it again in that kind of historical sense, if we go back hundreds of years, um, it is written from a masculine point of view. Let's think of, kind of the father of fantasy, and I don't say this to slight Tolkien because I enjoy Tolkien, but The Lord of the Rings was written from a masculine perspective, and you can see it in the text. If you start to break down the text and break down his female characters, you see that it is written from that very masculine um, viewpoint. And it's not that I want to come across and say that that's wrong, but for a very long time in fantasy we were only getting one side of the story, kind of like a lot of literature where the side of the story that we were getting was male and predominantly white. And things can change, and things have changed now in the 21st century. We still have a long way to go, but we're starting to get other stories. We're starting to get the perspectives of people of color. We're starting to get the perspectives of the LGBTQ community. And we're starting to get the perspectives of women. And that to me is something that's exciting. But we kind of also need to be aware of where we've come from, because that tone and that voice will play a role in what most of us are used to and how most of us are used to seeing things. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Sorry about that. Sorry about that in the background. My husband came into the room. Okay, so with this idea of breaking the norm. So you want to learn how to, not only when you're reading, but when you're writing. This is one thing that the women that I have worked with and the editors that I've worked with that, have knowledge in this idea of female agency and the male gaze have really taught me is, learn how to break down the text and learn how to pay attention to certain things. And I always say you want to do it in what you're writing and also in what you're reading, because you've kind of got to learn how to train your eye, so to speak, and how to recognize it. And so, some questions that you can ask yourself when it comes to paying attention to the agency of your female characters, ask yourself, what is their place and their role in the world that you've created? Because usually, when it comes to fantasy, even if it's based off of an existing world, we're creating our own world, we're kind of writing ourselves into it, so to speak. So, what is their place or their role in the world? Does that give them control over their choices and their life? Ask yourself, are they societally viewed as less than? Do you have a more patriarchal society where, women, and I'm covering women, but I want to preface this in saying that it's not just women that have this happen to. This happens to many, people of color, many different groups. But for this conversation, I'm going to discuss women. Are women considered societally less than? Are they bound to rigid social structures? Do they, they're, when you see them, you only see them in the home, or you only see them as a mother, or you only see them in a certain, job or something like that. And there's not anything wrong with a woman in the home, and there's not anything wrong with a woman as a mother, but do you only see them in that capacity? One thing that I've done in my writing that I have a lot of fun with, is I actually have in my first series that I wrote, I have a woman who is a warrior queen, and she's seen as a leader, but then I also took time to show her as a mother, so that we weren't seeing her in this rigid social structure where she only got to be one thing. She had multiple aspects to her character and multiple pieces of her life, so she not only was this leader, but she also was, a wife and a mother, and you saw that in the narrative. Are they able to have and express their own opinions, or is everyone else sort of making opinions for them? Do they make their own choices, or are choices being made for them by other people? That can be a really, really important one. I encourage people to look out for, because that can happen a lot in any narrative, but in fantasy in particular. I don't know if anybody's seen the Reese. I always think of the Reese Witherspoon video. There's a talk that she gives. I can't remember where it was, but she talks about the line in movies that she always hated, where, and I see this all the time in literature too, where the woman looks at the man and she goes, "What do we do now?" And she kind of makes the joke of, like, that in and of itself, it's stripping the agency away from the female character, because in that moment, she's not able, she's looking to someone else to go make this choice for me because I don't know what to do right now. So be aware of that stuff as you're reading and writing. And are they treated with respect? Are they objectified and dehumanized? That's another one where I really encourage people. I'm going to briefly touch on it today. The more research you can do on recognizing when people are objectified and when they are dehumanized, not just women, but I mean, for this talk, we're going to discuss women, but this happens across the board. The more you can start to recognize the language of, objectification and dehumanization, that's going to help you not use that and give your character agency. Because the second we objectify and we take someone's humanity away from them, you automatically take away their agency. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so this is gonna jump into the male gaze, and I'm gonna go through this quick, and like everything else, it's really complex, so this is kind of like the Cliff Notes version. Just know that there's a lot of complexity to this, and I know it says the male gaze, and I always, whenever I talk about this, I'm like, I don't say this, I'm not a man hater, I'm married, I have a wonderful husband, but this is something that, is part of our society, unfortunately. So oftentimes in fantasy, women are written to be like the stereotypical male. And I say the stereotypical male because I want to make a different kind of a difference there between, men as a whole, and then what we look is the stereotypical man, because the stereotypical patriarchal man, in my humble opinion, is not a well-rounded, emotionally healthy, man. There's kind of a difference there. But when it comes to fantasy, oftentimes women are written to be like that stereotypical man. This usually occurs when people end up writing in what we call the male gaze. And I included sort of a definition of the male gaze there. And it's the act of depicting women and the world from a masculine heterosexual perspective that presents and represents women as sexual objects. And the male gaze, I want to emphasize this, it's not just limited to male writers. When I started writing my books, as someone who had predominantly read a lot of fantasy growing up and in my formative teenage years, I wrote in the male gaze, and I didn't even realize that I was doing it. It wasn't until I lucked out and got in with the editor and women that, I've been working with in my writing that have kind of made me more aware of this, that I realized how unintentionally I was writing in the male gaze. Give you one example that comes to mind. When I write high fantasy and epic fantasy, and when I would talk about people's families, because traditionally in fantasy, if you flip through fantasy books, when it comes to people's families, whereas the focus is always on the father. It's, the father's this, father's that, the father's sword, the father's whatever. And I just out of habit, because that's what you read, I was doing that in my writing until someone pointed out to me and went, why is it the father? Why is it not the father and the mother? Or why is it the father and, sometimes the mother? Why is the mother not in that, when it comes to the family structure? And that's just one example of many, that a lot of us, including a lot of women, I think no matter what genre we write in, because again, historically, literature-wise, the only thing we were hearing for hundreds of years was the white male perspective. We kind of default to it. And, I don't want to say that and that, like trying to say that everyone's trying to push out white male writers or anything like that, but be aware of that so that you can find your voice, not just the voice of what you've read or what you've kind of had ingrained in you over the years. So I think learning how to recognize the male gaze and then adjust it is very. I want to talk about a little bit before we go to the next slide, that idea of sexual objects. This is a big one that I see in the male gaze. When you are writing attraction, be careful that you are not objectifying and sexualizing the other person. And I've seen this done when it comes to female characters, but I've seen it done when it's female characters talking about male characters as well, or male on male, or vice versa, or whatever. I mean, there's a ton of different ways to do it, but be careful that you're not objectifying when you're doing that, because again, that strips away the agency. And what I mean by that, it really is basically what it sounds like when you're taking away parts of the whole, when you're writing it in such a way that, we're focusing on one body, but usually it's going to be a body part. We're hyper focusing, on one body part, and that person's humanity, the respect for that person's values being, just goes out the window, and it just hones in on that one thing, that one object. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. One thing that happens when you write in this male gaze, when you start objectifying, when you start dehumanizing, it's going to create flat characters, particularly female characters. There's not going to be a whole lot of depth there. In particular, there's not going to be a whole lot of, emotional depth and character development. They're going to come across as very flat because you're only focusing on that one piece of them, and everything else falls by the wayside. This is something I've noticed a lot in fantasy over the years, where everyone will go, well, I added agency by, I mean, the assassin trope is really popular right now. Everybody will go, I added agency by giving them fighting skills and making them snarky. That isn't agency. In order for them to have agency, they have to have emotional depth, and they've got to have their own wants and desires. They've got to be a well-rounded character. So just, making them a really fierce assassin and a little bit snarky, again, if you start taking apart the text, a lot of the times that male gaze will still be there. Emotionally available characters are compelling no matter what the gender is. And this is why I say I'm discussing this from the perspective of women right now. But in my humble opinion, a lot of this is just creating good characters, period. People connect with characters that are emotionally compelling, again, no matter what their gender is. So that's something that I always tell everybody, no matter who you're writing or what perspective that you're writing from, people want, emotionally available, well-rounded characters to connect with. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so another thing that happens a lot of the times when it comes to females characters in fantasy is they will get written in a vacuum. I am going to use Tolkien as an example here, and look, I'm prefacing this by saying I love The Lord of the Rings, okay? So I'm not like, I always tell everybody, I'm like, just because I use an example doesn't mean that I don't, enjoy Tolkien's work. But that's a famous one that pretty much, anybody that enjoys fantasy knows. Okay, so let's look at Tolkien. Can anybody tell me, does Eowyn have any female friends? And does Arwen have any female friends? Or Galadriel that they actually interact with? Okay, yes, no, exactly, okay? A lot of the times in fantasy, when we see female characters, Tolkien being a perfect example, we see them in a vacuum. They don't end up having any female friends. They're always surrounded by men, and they're kind of like, a lot of the times they're kind of like an oddity. It's like the one woman in the world, and the rest of it is just men. And I would challenge you, start flipping through fantasy books, and you are going to be stunned when you start looking how many times this happens over and over and over again, even in stuff that comes out, recent stuff. Or if they do have friends, they'll have what I like to call their frenemies. It's like they're not really friends, or they're fighting over a guy or something like that. You don't see a lot of strong female friendships. So give your female characters friends, especially give them, it's all right for them to have other women friends, and they can actually be friends. They don't have to be at each other's throats all the time. They don't have to be catfighting all the time. They don't have to be overly dramatic with one another. Give them friends, and in particular, give them female friends. There's something called the Bechdel test. And this is something that's, does the world have two female characters that talk to each other about something other than a man? And this is something that a lot of writers use. I believe this came originally, I believe it came from comics, if I'm recalling correctly, came from the comic world. This is something that a lot of writers do use nowadays, and it is sort of, people ask themselves these questions. Do my female characters have female friends? Or are they kind of in this vacuum all on their own? But it's still, even if you go through a lot of modern day fantasy, you're still going to see a lot of that women characters existing in a vacuum. So I would encourage you that when you're working on stuff, kind of flip through it and ask yourself, that simple question: do I have two female characters in here, and are they able to have a conversation at some point with each other about something other than a man? Do they actually have some depth of friendship going on there? So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So you want to write your characters as authentic people. And again, a lot of the stuff I talked about, I was talking about it in reference to women, but this is just across the board. Write authentic people, write whatever characters you are, write them in a way that allows you to create authentic people having authentic connections with one another. Be careful not to fall for stereotypes. And again, that's one of those things that I would say that, we're discussing it in regards to women, but that's going to go with, anyone that you're writing, whether you're writing men, whether you're writing, someone of a different culture or something like that from you. Don't fall for stereotypes, do the work, and just be careful that you're not following into that trap. And if you aren't sure, ask for feedback. This is something that I think we are getting more aware of as writers in this day and age, but I still feel like there's more that could be going on. Perfect example, I write romance. So not only do I write from a female perspective, but I'm also writing from a male perspective as well. And I will have, my husband is very kind and agreed to do this for me, but I will have him read through what I've written and just ask him, does it from your male perspective, does this line up? And you can do that, vice versa. If you are writing from a perspective or a place that you're not familiar with, even if you're writing about someone that's had an experience that maybe you haven't had before. I mean, maybe, you're a woman writing about another woman, but, it's something that you've never experienced. Go find someone that has had that experience or comes from that place and just ask them, would you be willing to read this over for me? And then prepare yourself for their feedback. Be willing to accept what they give you, so that you can make a more authentic, deep narrative there. So that's everything. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'm happy to answer them.
We had some comments in the chat.
Okay.
About the trope, what do we do now is one of my pet peeves. And Tia said it's right up there with hiding in a corner or simply screaming while the hero and villain fight it out. She does not.
It is. I actually saw an ad for a book the other day that was the first line in the ad was the female character looking at the male character going, what do we do now? And I was like, oh, we've got to get rid of this trope.
What are some examples of female characters that you think are especially well written?
I should have made a list because I feel like somebody was going to ask me this and I've got to come up off the top of my head stuff that I've really liked. Look, I'm really bad. I'm looking at my bookshelf. I read a lot of romance, so most of what I'm going to that I've got over here is a lot of romance. Look over here. Trying to think of what my favorite ones are. There's a lot of ones that I do really like. Julia Quinn has some of her more recent stuff that I really, really like. Some of her older stuff, as much as I like it, she still has a lot of not giving female characters agency, but in a lot of her newer stuff she does. Why did I forget this? Beverly Jenkins. Beverly Jenkins does an amazing job. She is a romance writer, but she does an amazing job giving her female characters agency. I would highly, highly recommend her stuff. I think someone asked.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. Do you ever have awkward characters as heroes or heroines?
I mean, I do. I would say that I do. I like to write people, and people are not perfect. And so I think a little bit of awkwardness, and people can learn. I think you can write someone. My first series that I came out with, it was actually really tough. I had a hard time with the female character through the editing process and working on it because she came from a background and culture where she didn't have a lot of agency, and it was a little tough to make her likable in a lot of ways because of that. And then throughout the course of the series, she learned agency. So, I mean, I like to see characters that can change. I think you can have characters that can start out a little bit awkward, or I think you can have characters that they're maybe not as self-aware as they could be. And I think it can be really fascinating to then surround them by characters who are more self-aware, and just kind of see them go through that own personal journey. I think there was one more question on here that I saw.
There's a couple more things. We did have a
Okay.
comment from Matthew that says, I actually have been aware of my writing female characters. I self-learned to write characters as authentic without realizing it. So that's good.
Yeah.
And then Tia says, before beginning stories, do you consider archetypes or just write?
Um, I am a planner, so I usually have a really, like, I'm one of those people that I usually have like a really intense plan written out. And I would say probably, archetypes are probably written into that. I tell everybody I'm a flexible planner because sometimes even though I have a plan or I have a particular archetype in mind, I might start writing and it might just change, or adjust. So yeah, I'm gonna go with that. I'm a flexible planner, so I'm flexible with my archetypes. I probably have some in mind, but I'm open to them changing kind of as the story progresses.
And JR wants to know what's coming up next.
So I actually just released my third book in my fantasy romance, romantic fantasy series. I just released that at the end of October. And the series is The Tales of Pern Cohen. I will put a link to my website where you can go and find those. They're available on Amazon as well. So I just released the third book, which is called The Successor. And then I have hopefully 2, maybe 3 more books coming out in that series next year. That I am right now. I'm just working on getting everything straight so that I can, like I said, hopefully get 3 books out next year, at least 2. So I'm kind of getting all my ducks in a row right now.
And what places can folks find your books?
I'm gonna stick in here my website. You can go there, and that's going to have links to everything. That's everything is on Amazon, or the books can be purchased from me directly via the website that showed up there.
And Trevor comments, I keep meaning to read the Magician's books, but the show based on these books has great, strong, flawed, fully formed female characters.
Yeah, you're getting a lot more. I always say things are changing. It's not like it was, 50, 60 years ago. I mean, things are changing. I think we still have a ways to go. But I think things are changing, and I think people are getting more aware of it. And like I said, it's a learning curve for me where I'm still, learning how to be more aware.
Great. Do you have any final comments for folks before we move on to the next author?
Yeah, Tia talked about I see more diversity in movies than books. Yeah, I would say too, Tia. Actually, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but no, actually, I do think we're seeing more diversity in TV shows and movies. I mentioned Julia Quinn. She just had the Bridgerton series comes out in December, and I'm so excited at the diversity of the cast that they did for that. Was just incredible. Yeah, I do think we're seeing it more in the movies than books. I'm hopeful maybe books will catch up down the road. I'm seeing it some in books. I hope, maybe they'll kind of catch up, but that is, I think for some reason it's a little bit more in that one media form than the other.
All right. Anything else you wanted to add before we move on, Hannah?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. I know I went through everything really fast, so hopefully I didn't lose everybody
Nope.
with all those different terms.
We've been moving pretty fast in general today, which is not necessarily a bad.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on, and I hope that that was helpful in some way to everybody.
You're welcome. We've got some thank yous popping through for you, so thanks for being here.
Thank you.